So we're still on part 2, roots of Black Radicalism, Atlantic slave trade, and African labor. The demonstration of the relationship between slavery and the development of Western Europe, however, need not end there. Crazy. I need a stretch. One other sort of direct evidence respecting the profitability of slave labor can be found. Oh my god! And during cheer, our coaches would make us like lay down and yell our things so that we would enunciate. And I actually have a deeper voice, but you know how Black women, like when I speak in my like this, when I'm speaking from my diaphragm, like lower but louder, that's my kid. I use that voice, like my deep voice, because I don't yell at children. It's not my responsibility, but I do have a loud voice because like I would be working with kids. I'd be like the only one with like 14 kids. Oh my god. And sometimes when I need because sometimes I get overstimulated. It's a lot of kids. So sometimes when I need everyone to stop, I say the freeze game. I yell freeze game and I do it in a deeper voice and everyone stops and I can be like, okay. You know what I mean? But anyways, it helps with enunciation though, like to get from your diaphragm. If you can talk loud and enunciate the words in like a cheer, for example, it's on your stomach. It's like it's training you to not like lose your voice and stuff. But typically I speak so high up because of the way that like you know how like some just talking that regularly, someone would talk to me and I'd like say something and they'd be like, oh my god, are you mad? And I'm like, no, I'm just speaking, you know. But I guess it's also because of like, I don't care, it does not matter. So one other sort of direct evidence respecting the profitability of slave labor can be found in the later work of Richard Paris. I don't know how to say it. It's Pares. A scholar who earlier on, MacDonald reminds us, had questioned the relationship between capitalism and slavery. Discussing the wealth of the planters themselves, Paris wrote in 1960, the absentee sugar planters were, with the East Indian nabobs, the most conspicuous. We're already on 3 minutes, girl, and I didn't even start. I'm sorry for going off on a tangent. Sorry, guys. This is like we're on FaceTime. I swear. It's like a book club, but I'm just reading it to you. But conspicuous, meaning standing out, clearly conspicuous. Conspicuous. Because I still need to do like oh wait, no, I'm gonna keep that in my brain so I can do it. Because sometimes, anyways, the most conspicuous rich men of their time. Other absentee planters were nothing to them. There were some coffee and indigo absentees in France, but the tobacco planters of Virginia, guys, sometimes driving around in Virginia, that's where I live. Don't look me up. Also, my address is wrong. So don't look me up. Like, that's weird. Don't look people up. But driving around in Virginia, no, but I'm so serious. Like, don't do that. I don't know, because me saying don't do it makes people like, I don't think like people would actually, but you know what I mean? Like, saying don't do something makes people want to do things in general, but I don't know why. I'm just saying don't be weird. But, please. But you can see like driving around, you see like big areas of, well, one, you see some Confederate flags. I forget that word, like the most northern southern state, one of the, because I think there's some above us or next to us. But anyways, I need to look at the map. Shut up. But you see like big areas of like farming and stuff, and sometimes I'm like, no, in Maryland. sometimes if you go up and I'll be like, this used to be a plantation home, I can tell. And it's like, I don't know, it always feels like not weird, but like, okay, I'll take time to develop that thought. But yeah, I'll take time to develop that thought. But the tobacco planters in Virginia and even the rice planters of Carolina could not afford to behave in England like the sugar planters. They might go. Oh, it's showing like the different like the different stages of wealth. Like you'll have the billionaires and then the millionaires and then this and then that. You know what I mean? Depending on like what type of trade you're in. Like even now, like you got the Elon Musks, but they also got the Kim Kardashians, and then you know what I mean, like that. They might go to England for their education, but unlike the sugar planters, they returned home when it was over. For in Virginia and Maryland, unlike the islands, life was tolerable and a real local patriotism came more easily to the planters. Besides, their estates were mostly too small to support the absentee owner for his whole life. Yet they lived a luxurious life at home. Another clue, also drawn from I feel bad for not saying his right name. It's Pares. Was the source of what was the source of the capital that edged planters into the indebtedness in which they were notorious. The money came in the last resort from the planters themselves. The money which was received from one planter was lent again either to him or to another planter. Thus it was the planter who was paying, so to speak, for his own enslavement. The profits of the plantation were the source which fed the indebtedness charged upon the plantations themselves. In this sense, Adam Smith was wrong. The wealth of the British West Indies did not all proceed from the mother country. From other initial loans, after some initial loans in the earliest period, which merely primed the pump, the wealth of the West Indies was created out of the profit of the West Indies themselves, with some assistance from the British taxpayer. Much of it found a permanent home in Great Britain. Like think about like right now with I'm trying to think of a specific place where like anyways, but you know what you like, okay, just hearing that you can already tell the patterns that you'll see in present day, like now, you know, because even plantations, where are my notes at, because I actually want to say that one out loud. Da, 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 da. Plantations were give me a sec. Plantations are a system of European imperialism created the plantation as an economic unit, and see how capitalism is dependent on slavery, imperialism, genocide, and violence, right? So that's what capitalism, and then the system of European imperialism, this is from Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora, these notes, and we will be reading that book on this channel. But anyways, the system of we'll just come back to that. The system of European imperialism created the plantation as an economic unit and as a system to be utilized in the exploitation of the natural resources of those areas where the sovereignty of Europe was extended, following the lead of industrial capitalists, traders, and adventurers. Okay. Even the fabled decline of European merchants in the New World in the 18th century provides little support on the thesis that the slave system was of marginal economic significance to metropolitan development. Here again, the later Paris intervenes. He maintains that the explanation of this phenomenon lies both in K.G.B. Davis's assertion that the merchants had been displaced by planters engaged in entrepreneurship and the fact that Europeans were being displaced by Africans. As the white population diminished in most of the British islands and were replaced by slaves who were hardly allowed to consume anything, the market for European goods have fallen quite considerably. Oh my god, and and now we're on like a global plantation kind of, and like inflation, like you can see those, okay. But it's not good. I'm just, when you can just, it's like when you see those patterns or just notice them, like I definitely need like to articulate better what I'm thinking, but I think that comes with like writing things down rather than like just saying it off my head. Because like, rewriting, like the first thought's not always the best thought, but thinking about like patterns, like once you can see those patterns or seeing things and identifying them, it's easier to understand how do you take it down. And so, in a sense, I mean, not really. It's easier said than done, but just at least noticing and recognizing the patterns in history in terms of like the structures and how they're set up and how that plays out into modern day, you're able to like, oh, okay, I see it, right? Like even with prison, like McDonald's right now, that the fast food chain uses prison labor, and thinking about how that also, you know what I mean, and how that connects to the military, whatever, and how and the BDS list, and like, you know what I mean, like those types of things, and then how like prison labor as a whole slavery was not abolished completely with like prison labor, all that stuff. Let me stop going off on tangents. I apologize. Incidentally, the reduction of the number of their customers helped to account for the decline of the class of resident merchants. Finally, one might add to the testimony of contemporaries. The comments come from widely different moments in the business of slavery, but their sources, their specifics, and their timing all describe the enthusiasm with which the system of slavery was undertaken. From the archives of the first large-scale introduction of Africans into the New World, Villa discovers, in report about the what? I don't know this word. Okay. AS. Oh, it's Spanish, that's why. Asiento. I do know that word, I think.
Asiento.
I do! I did know that word. Meaning. What? Is a contract or convention between Spain and another power or company or individual for furnishing slaves. Oh. In report about the asientos taken to the Junta in 1612, it was affirmed that should the trade be lost, not only would the income produced by it be lost, but also the sales tax, a la cabala, and the export-import tax, averia, on the money that arrived from the Indies. Moreover, the buying and selling of slaves was one of the most important and lucrative sources of the alacabalas. Almost 200 years later, on the 20th of February, 1793 to be exact, Byron Edwards wrote to Henry Dundas from Jamaica, Our harbors are full of Guineamen, African slave ships, yet the price keeps up enormously. Mr. Shirley gave €100 a head for a pick of 20 Coromontes out of the ship of Mr. Lindo's. And so long as the notion continues that the trade will be abolished, people will buy at any price, even to their own ruin, and the destruction of half the Negroes for the want of provisions, meaning that the planters are not in general provided with sufficient means to support so great an influx of newly imported Negroes all of a sudden. From whatever vantage point one chooses, the relationship between slave labor, the slave trade, and the weaving of the early capitalist economies is apparent. Whatever were the alternatives, the point remains. Historically, slavery was a critical foundation for capitalism. Okay, how many pages is this? We're at 14. Oh, just 3 pages. 4. Okay, the column marked British capitalism. We may now have sufficient grounds for saying that in the New World, the British and the French entrepreneurs, following the models provided by the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, substantially substituted human capital for commodities in the 17th and 18th centuries. We will now follow this British trade for the moment because it seems the best documented, because it so firmly seats slavery in the movement for mercantile to industrial capitalism, and because many of the clearest tracings of Black radical tradition lead back to it. That's why. That's important. That's what we're focusing on. Da, 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 da. To be sure, the leaders of the colonized... Ooh, excuse me. I need to move my legs. That's why I'm... Okay. To be sure, the leaders of the colonizing efforts of Britain have begun by exporting those colonized peoples to whom they have immediate access. That is the Irish. You know how we talked about that? How we talked about the Irish being the first Black people? We have already made mention of the fact that, as well as the collateral use of labor from Germany and Great Britain itself, it appears that the earliest inventors in the colonies, lord proprietors, politicians, and merchants, according to Paris, had economic designs that at first could be met by a modest labor pool. As independent venturers, the landed rich seemed most frequently to anticipate that their colonies would produce an income resembling in form the manorial dues to which they were accustomed to in England. The joint companies in which some lords, along with merchants and public representatives of the bourgeoisie, also took an interest, were typically more trade-oriented. These companies were promoted for the colonial cultivation of cotton, tobacco, indigo, ginger, and the production of extractive industries such as timber, glass, iron, and precious metals. Thus, until the arrival of sugar in the early 1640s and the development of large plantations, labor was adequately supplied by Europeans, indentured peasants, political outcasts, produced at varying times by national and civil wars, and poor and orphaned females, only some of whom possessed bad reputations. As Richard B. Moore reiterates, their lots were oppressive. Somewhat less erroneous. I think that's it. Erroneous. No. Onerous. Involving an amount of effort and difficulty that was oppressively burdensome. Then African slavery. So it's like indentured servitude was like a little bit less bad, but still quite oppressive, was the system of indentured slavery of Europeans, forced in one way or another into the colonies, whether on the mainland or in the islands. Writings of this, the Jesuit priest Joseph J. Williams relates how Irish peasants were hunted down as men, hunt down game, and were forcibly put on board ships and sold to the planters of Barbados. Between 1624 and 1634, tobacco became the main staple of the colonies, earning in that period profits that attracted more and more English and French planters to it. By the end of this period, a glut of tobacco had hit the market and prices declined. The resultant long depression of the late 1630s and early 1640s compelled the search for a new staple, despite the lingering expectations that tobacco would recover. In England, an additional strain was being generated. Harried by depression and ever-growing threat of civil war, Englishmen left their homeland in such numbers during the 1630s that their exodus was called the Great Migration. Beatty tells us many of these newcomers settled in the West Indies, and particularly Barbados, which only made the attempt to locate a substitute for tobacco more desperate. The cunning of history then intervened, cutting off Europe's supply of New World sugar as one result of the wars for the possession of Brazil between the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Luso-Brazilians. Okay. The cultivation of sugar in the English colonies began consequently in the late 1630s. Once the techniques of sugar cultivation and refining were mastered, it rapidly displaced the less profitable crops of tobacco, indigo, and ginger in the islands. With the massive demands for labor that sugar production engendered, the appetite for colonial production for labor increasingly outpaced supply. Having already decimated those aboriginal populations they encountered in the West Indies, the English mercantile and planter bourgeoisie found it necessary to and expedient to expand their Irish and homeland strategy to West Africa. Ooh. As they did so, the scale of their enterprise grew beyond anything seen in English history. During the 17th century as a whole, Curtin claims 60% of the slave trade in the New World went to the Hispanic colonies. This may or may not have been the case, since Curtin's figures have been shown to have rather erratic authority and accuracy, meaning that we have to take his opinion with a grain of salt. Or, yeah. I don't know, but I really need chapstick. Here at least, he has consistently maintained some caution in the wrong direction, and even, on occasion, admitted to error again towards lessening the numbers of Africans oppressed into slavery. The more immediate concern, however, is that by the last quarter of the century, English merchants supplying slaves primarily to the British Caribbean had surpassed the Portuguese and the Dutch, their predecessors in the trade. Curtin's approximations revealed that while imports by the Portuguese and Dutch merchants during the first half of the century exceeded the English trade by a substantial margin, a combined 327,000 for the Dutch and the Portuguese as compared to the 20,700 for English traders. By the third quarter, the English territories had overtaken the Spanish colonies in labor imports. By the last 25 years of the 17th century, English merchants had more than doubled their performance in human trading for the previous quarter. 69,000 for the earlier periods versus 174,000. Thereby besting their commercial contemporaries, this achievement again was largely due to the demands of sugar production. By the end of the 18th century and the abolition of the legal British slave trade in 1807, British factors, merchants, and traders alone were to account for the transportation of 3,699,572 more Africans to the New World. If we were to accept Curtin's argument concerning the level of death in transit during the period, then perhaps as many as 400,000 or more of these people never saw the western end of the Atlantic. They died in transit. They died in transit. There we go. And thereby produced one profoundly tragic measure of the extent to which the development of capitalist world systems depended on the labor its metropolis could not produce. The Africans were, however, not the only ones to be unfortunately used in the slave trade. The greed of the English and European merchants easily overran their racial and national sympathies. Thus, it was that the crews of their slaving ships died at rates perhaps even higher than their human cargoes. In time, English seamen sang about their fate in graphic terms. Beware and take care of the blight of Benin. For one that comes out, there are 40 that go in. After the 1680s, Jamaica consistently began to exceed Barbados and the Leeward Islands in sugar exports. By the early 1700s, Jamaica's slave population followed suit, reflecting the island's preeminent role in British colonial commerce. By the end of the English trade in slaves, something like 38% of the slave labor transported by English shippers had been relocated to Jamaica. In almost equal parts, the origins of these Africans had been along the routes that fed into the slave ports at the Bight of Biafra. I don't know if I said that correctly. Biafra, the Gold Coast, Central Africa, the Bight of Benin, and Sierra Leone. This ethnic distribution, however, was not the result of a consistent or regular pattern of recruitment. recruitment. Initially, Orlando Patterson concludes the predominant groups were the Coromantes, Coromantees. Coromantun was a port about 70 miles west of Akara, Accra, the Akan, the Ga Andagame peoples, and the Ga Adagame peoples. After 1675 and for the rest of the century, the British trade for Jamaica shifted to Angola and the Iwi-speaking people of Dahomey. Between 1700 and 1730, the slave coast and Ghana became the favorite sources only to be succeeded themselves in the early years between 1730 and 1760 by the Niger and cross deltas. At the end of the 18th century, the Congo once again became the dominant region. See that? The Congo, where enslaved people were taken, and then all the way around connects back to how the Congo is being like slave labor is literally being used and they're exploiting the land. Like, figure eight. Isn't that interesting? Not interesting like good, but interesting like, oh, our liberation is dependent on the liberation of all peoples type of interesting. That. The Congo once again became the dominant region, followed successively by the Niger and cross deltas, the Gold Coast, and by a much smaller order, the Windward Coast. In many ways, the Jamaican trade followed a pattern established by European mercantile predecessors of the English. They too had deposited the majority of their African labor in the islands of the Greater and Lesser Antilles. Antilles. Both tobacco and sugar had something to do with this, since the islands possessed the ideal climate for the production of these crops. The Portuguese, with the lush tropical fertility of their Brazilian territories, had been the exception. An exception that Curtin maintains accounted for approximately 38% of the total number of African peoples brought to the New World. To the North American colonies, it can be estimated that the British merchants sent approximately 20% of their slave cargoes in the 18th century. Surprisingly, perhaps, to the most present-day North Americans, this amounts to less than 5% of the total number of Africans brought to the New World by European merchants. Curtin best estimates that to be 399,000 Africans were brought to the English colonies during the entirety of the slave trading period. Another 28,000, he suggested, came to the continent by way of French traders supplying the Louisiana region. Inikori, however, warns us that meaningful import estimates for the United States are yet to be made. This African population, however, differed from the distribution in Jamaica in that at least a quarter of these people had originated from Angolan ports. Nearly as many came from the Bight of Biafra, Biafra, half as many from the Gold Coast and Senegambia, followed by ever-decreasing proportions from the ports of Sierra Leone and Bight of Benin and Central Africa. In South Carolina, blacks made up 60% of the colony's population in the 18th century. In Virginia, the comparable figure was 40%. They were used as laborers in tobacco farms and later on cotton plantations, but they also worked in mines, salt, and rope works, and they trained as shipwrights, blacksmiths, and as various kinds of woodworkers, including carpenters, coppers, wheelwrights, and sawyers. Those who were imported directly from Africa were termed outlandish, to distinguish them from their masters called the new Negroes of the field and the supposed deraciated, acculturated artisan slaves with whom they were more comfortable. As General Mullen had demonstrated, these distinctions were for the colonists' practical considerations. In sample runs of the South Carolina Gazette in the early 1750s and 1771, there was clear evidence of tribal cooperation in advertisements for the return of 4 new Gambian men 3 Angolians, a few short fellows, 6 other Angolans, and 4 men from the Fula country. The invention of the Negro was proceeding apace with the growth of slave labor. Somewhat paradoxically, the more that Africans and their descendants assimilated cultural material from colonial society, the less human they became in the minds of the colonists. Think about that. The more that one assimilates into the dominant culture, the less human you become. Because think about the ways in which, like, your humanity is dependent on your own culture, in a sense, generally speaking. But think about that. The more assimilated one becomes into the dominant ideology, into the dominant culture, the less human you are. I didn't say it. Just as instructive, the rebels among these Africans and Negroes were described as runaways, a term that had endured in the historiography of the period. It should be remembered, however, that it was from the efforts of men and women such as these that the black settlements of Virginia, Piedmont, and the Afro Creek exiles of Florida, the Seminoles, would consist. In similar fashion, the maroon peoples of the Caribbean and South America would be formed. They were as well, at the end of the 18th century, among the estimated 55,000 who fled to the British forces and loyalist settlements when the colonists pursued the logic of the fear of their own enslavement to the point of revolution. Still, enough of the African laborers remained in the colonies of North America and the Indies to play a significant role in the development of the English imperial economy. The triangular trade of slaves, as Eric Williams asserted, broadened the home market by stimulating the production of British manufacturers in English merchant exchanges in Africa for black workers. Once in place, these workers, almost done, formed their labor for British tropical production, craftwork, and extractive industries. The end result was capital accumulation for the advancement of productive forces in England and Europe, the Industrial Revolution, for the growth of staple industries in Northern America, fisheries, food crops, etc., for timber, shipbuilding, and textiles, and for the expansion of colonization and settlement. The concomitant, however, was the degradation of these African peoples and their social institutions when touched by the trade, and, as Walter Rodney had argued, the underdevelopment of Africa's economies. This trade, this movement of black workers, though, did not end with slavery's legal termination in the 19th century. Leopold's Congo, Harry Johnson's Central Africa, Cecil Rhodes' Southern Africa, Lugard's West Africa, Portuguese Africa, the French Africa, as well as the New World's slaves' descendants all contributed to the further development of the capitalist world system, as peasants, as tenant farmers, as migrant workers, as day laborers, as domestic servants, as well as wage labor. Their expropriation extended into the present century. Even in the destruction of the means of production, the wars that Marx and Engels had stipulated as inevitable in capitalism, black labor was pressed into service. They were exempt from no aspect of exploitation. We're done with chapter 5, and now it's 6. That one, girl, it's good though.